This time on Poll Hub, our April America Now Index is reflecting the mood of the country. The number is moving up for the first time this year, and it's driven by Americans' growing optimism about the rebounding economy. And then Biden's first 100 days. How's he doing with Americans? Well, better than one of his predecessors, but not so good as another. We'll explain. And Lee's back this week to deliver his fun fact, and it's about fevers. No, not the kind we've been worried about for the last year, a happier kind, he'll tell you. Plenty to explore, so let's get to it. And hi, everybody. Welcome to Poll Hub. I'm Jay DeDapper, Director of Innovation here at the Marist Poll.
And I'm Mary Griffith, Media Director for the Marist Poll, sitting in for Barbara Carvalho today.
And I'm Lee Miringoff, Director of Marist College Institute for Public Opinion, and I'm back this week.
Well, not only are you back, we are, for the first time recording this podcast in more than a year, two of us are actually at the Marist Poll physically. Which is a rare event. We are beginning to open back up and we're fully masked and all that kind of thing, but we are back on campus. We've been back a little bit at a time, but for two of us to be in the same building in front of mics at the same time, it's kind of a sign that things are opening up. And I think we have another sign about that, and that is our April America Now Index. For 3 months, January, February, March, the index number sat at the same number, and it is now going up. What do we make of that?
Oh, well, the numbers I saw that were the real boost were in the economy. Not surprising, but the economy went up 0.5 of a point from 5.2 to 5.7, and each of the subcategories, each of the four categories, showed an increase. The biggest ones were in time to make a good purchase or investment. It's a good time to make purchases or investment. That took a big increase, and the better financially for you and your household in the next few months. The sense that was also improving took a bounce, and frankly, they all did. Jobs right now easy to find. That one took a big kick also.
Yeah, and I think jobs really is the figure that we should really be focusing on, at least to start off today. Jobs are easy to find. That score is now at 5.6, and that's the highest in the history of the index since we began asking this last May, and that's up from 4.9. Lee, just to kind of underscore what you were saying, when we're looking at the consumer market, that is a good time to make purchases and investments. It's at 5.5, also the highest in the history of the index, up from 4.8.
So I guess what we're seeing here is, well, Jay told us, didn't you, last month, Jay, that you predicted that this was all going to happen as COVID got a little bit better in terms of, the vaccines and the numbers improving, that the economy was going to open up and we would see a change in our index, which we hadn't for quite some time. Jay, take a bow.
Yeah, no, I'm excited about that. No, I think what this speaks to is that the index is doing a good job of reflecting America overall. And we ask about a number of categories. We ask about health, we ask about the community, we ask about the economy. And in all these things, I think there's a pretty accurate reflection in a broad sense of what Americans are feeling. So these economic numbers are really kind of huge. That jump of 0.5 is the biggest single jump we've seen from month to month. And I think it's a reflection of what's happening in the economy. The fact that some other things are kind of creeping up, some things have been high, but some other things are creeping up, I think just speaks to the sense of a little bit more optimism than we'd been feeling. And I don't think that we're going too far on a limb to say it is probably almost entirely based on what's happening with the vaccinations and with COVID.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that. Every one of the 16 subcategories that we asked was the same or went up, with the exception only of two, which was whether people consider themselves in excellent health or not. That just went down 0.1 of a point, and whether people think that children and their grandchildren will have a better life than they did, also going down 0.1 of a point. Everything else was the same or went up, and as we indicated, and Mary indicated at the beginning, the economy really leading the charge there in terms of the improvement.
Yeah, and I do want to point out, when we look at the health index, that number has been consistently strong over the last year or so. But when we look at the figure, there's little risk to your health right now. That score is at 6.4. I actually believe that this is the highest in the history of the index as well. And so, Jay, that really comes back to your point that the vaccine rollout, the success with that to date really is hitting home with Americans.
Yeah, I think that again is reflected in every area of this poll. The one area of concern continues to be kind of people feeling this is a just society, the questions around that. And there's a big racial disparity there when we look at that. And I think that's, if there's some unfinished business here, remember the last year has been all about really two things, racial justice and COVID. And I think the unfinished business, at least that we're seeing again in this broad kind of temperature taking of America, is that while the economy is getting better, COVID is not behind us, but we're on, we see a light at the end of the tunnel. I'm not sure we're seeing that same thing reflected when it comes to racial justice.
Yeah, I was just going to add to that because you took the words right out of my mouth on that one. All of the indicators are at 5 or better. And I don't know if that's something to write home about, but at least on the
on a
better
scale of
side
1 to 10, 5 is,
yeah. But as you indicated, the Fair and Just Society went up from 4.4 to 4.6, but it's the only score on here that's below 5. And and as you look at the index as a whole, and we're somewhat relieved to see, America's improving, as things get back to normal, but we still see the overall is a 6.4 on a scale of 0 to 10. So, there's lots of room here to improve upon, but one of the things the index does tell us is kind of like a mood on all kinds of things that are very important. It sets the context, and clearly, things have changed. It took a while, but things have changed since Biden took the oath of office. And it's for the very fact that, as you say, the economy is doing better.
Yeah, it's hard to talk about the mood of the nation without thinking about politics, although we don't specifically ask about politics in the America Now National Outlook Index. But we have been busy, as we always are at the Marist Poll, and we did ask Americans to weigh in on President Biden's first 100 days in office. And as we record this podcast, it is Biden's 100th day in office. So, Lee, how do Americans think the president is doing?
Well, I think generally, in our poll, he's at a high point. But what's interesting about him, and I think there's reasons to explain this, he's doing better than Donald Trump at this point. Not as good as Barack Obama was, not as good as a lot of presidents were in earlier times, but his 54% approval rating is, the beginnings of a pattern. I mean, he's been in the 50s, he's been creeping up each poll. And I think, the 54 is a good number, it's a decent number. But when you have such a polarized nation that we have, I mean, how many people are really on the fence? How many people watching this state of, this joint, not State of the Union, but it's joint address to Congress yesterday? How many people are watching and saying, okay, let's see what this guy has? Or are most of the people watching supporters with a few opponents in there? And does anybody really change their mind all that much? So, it's very hard. There's not a lot of people on the fence to pick up from. And I think the days right now, as long as we remain polarized, where someone's going to be getting, 40s or 60s or lower than 40s or more than 60s in their approval rating is probably not going to happen in the near future. I don't know, just my take on that.
So we asked the question, there's a lot of polls out on 100 days, this
Sure.
kind of arbitrary 100-day thing, but I like the way we ask about a grade. What grade would you give the president this far in? And we've been asking that question so we can compare it to other grades that other presidents have gotten. And I think it's notable that while Trump did kind of the least well in that, getting the not great A's and B's, what's interesting in comparison is that Biden gets 22% of Americans are giving him an A, 27% a B, so 49%, very close to his approval rating. But 26% give him an F. Now, in Donald Trump's case, Fs were kind of popular as well, and so it kind of points, I think, to me that what we're seeing in this grading anyway is that the partisanship that we thought maybe was really heavy in the Obama years really is baked in much more now than it was. I mean, only a very few number of Americans gave Barack Obama an F back at that time. And so I think that this partisan nature of things that I think has been around for quite some time really has baked in very solidly over the last 4 or 5 years. I think it's showing here.
And just to dig a little bit further into some of the numbers, when we look at whether or not President Biden is keeping his campaign promises, 63% of Americans say that he is keeping those promises, and that includes 30% of Republicans. And another question that I like that's included in the poll, I think there are certain questions that each of us has a tendency or an affinity toward, is when we look at the expectations, whether or not President Biden is meeting the expectations of the nation. 62% of Americans say President Biden has met or exceeded their expectations of him as president. 48% believe that Biden has met the expectations, and 14% think that he has exceeded them. Lee, again, that comparison, how's he doing in terms of his predecessors?
Yeah, he's better and worse. It's good news, bad news for him in terms of where the predecessors were, and I think that makes sense. I don't think there's a surprise in there. I just want to go back to one other thing and get both your reactions to this. Joe Biden has talked about how he was going to unify the nation, and he was going to do it in a bipartisan way. Okay, you've seen some votes so far in Congress. They're hardly bipartisan. I mean, Democrats going one way, Republicans going another way. Then you see, like on the grade, for example, only 7% of Republicans gave him a B or better. So clearly the Republicans are not enamored. And again, no bipartisanship there. However, when you look at some issues, and we've seen this in our polls and others, gun control, a variety of his handling of things, the economy and some, immigration not so much. You do see a lot of the country infrastructure are moving, they're taking his cue in terms of his leadership on these issues. He's picking popular issues, even if Congress is still divided and the American people remain divided. It's sort of an interesting, they're willing to grant him the benefit of the doubt on the issues, but that hasn't moved over to them liking him necessarily. I'm talking about Republicans in that case. What's your take on this bipartisanship and his promises?
I just want to disagree with you on something, Lee. I don't think that he said that he was going to unify and it was going to be bipartisan. I think he said he was going to unify America, and he has made a very strict distinction between bipartisanship and unifying. Yes, he's been seeking bipartisan support for bills, but he certainly didn't seek it very hard on the COVID relief bill, right? I mean, he had a meeting with him one day and announced that, this is what we're doing the next day. I think it's a very smart political play on his part, and I think Republicans think the same thing, because this is working out in his favor in the polls like this, that he is making a very clear distinction between unifying America and being bipartisan. And what I want to get at here is that you identified the 7% of Republicans who gave an A or a B. We know that fewer people are self-identifying as Republicans. I'm interested in the independent number. 44% of independents give him an A or a B. 44% of independents did not give Donald Trump an A or a B at the beginning in the first 3 months of his term. So I am much more interested in looking not at the Democrat or Republican numbers here, but at the independent numbers, because in poll after poll, whether it's approval or these letter grades or anything we're looking at here, the Republicans and Democrats are basically mirror images of what they were in Trump. Democrats love Biden, they hate, Republicans hate him, and vice versa. The independents have changed. Trump never got a majority of independents, and Biden has.
Interesting.
Or at least a plurality.
Yeah. Mary, what did you think when you were watching his address to the nation in Congress? I was surprised by how many times he was willing to accept some input from the Republicans for Plan B as opposed to his Plan A. He left the door open for some input. I guess on infrastructure, maybe he doesn't feel he has the 60 votes in the Senate, and he clearly then needs, if the filibuster doesn't change, he needs 10 Republicans. What was your sense of that dynamic He complimented Mitch McConnell. I mean, referenced him. I mean, I thought there was some interesting gambits he was playing there.
Yeah, I think it's true to form Biden. I mean, he campaigned on the promise to unify. He campaigned on the promise to work across the aisle. And I think that that's really what we've been seeing throughout the first 100 days. And I think he wants to continue to hit that message home as his presidency continues. I will say that overall, I think it was a unique speech, not in the sense um, of issues per se, but I think it was quite unique in terms of his tone, much softer, much different tone, a much more plain spoken tone than we've heard from recent presidents. Certainly a different kind of speech than his former boss, Barack Obama, would deliver. And there was something very interesting and engaging about his speech. I really think that he was trying to speak to the common Joe and Jane out there, and try to punch through with certain demographics and perhaps try to bring over some of the Trump voters who didn't vote for him, obviously. But before we move on, there was one figure that I did want to point out for us to talk about, and the economy seems to be the topic of the day. And we did ask whether or not Joe Biden's decisions have strengthened the U.S. economy, and 49% of Americans say that he has strengthened the U.S. economically, and that's comparable to the highest point in Trump's presidency, and that was in October 2019 when Trump was at 50%. So I just want to raise this question before, again, we move on to the next bit of the podcast. Is this a win for Joe Biden, considering that the economy was always Trump's forte and his strong suit, rather?
Yeah, I think that's very important. I think it's a win for him, but it's only the second inning. I don't think we've gotten well into the administration yet. I know everybody's talking, he's got to do everything very quickly, but 2022 is still a ways away. I think everybody's thinking about it, but clearly, as COVID becomes something in our rearview mirror, which we can only hope for is soon, I think the economy then continues to improve. And that can't do Joe Biden any harm.
I just want to mention, we'd asked two questions about the coronavirus, and I do think it's important to note these. I know it's not Biden's 100th day and it's a little bit outside the frame, but two things stood out here. One, we asked a question about how soon people think life's going to get back to normal. And what really struck me is that when we ask, in the next month, 2 to 3 months, 6 months, about a year or longer than that, essentially we're at the same place we've been for the last few months, which is that a vast majority of Americans believe that it's at least 6 months away before we get back to normal. The other is that we talked a couple of weeks ago about vaccine hesitancy. There's been a lot of talk about the numbers that we had in our poll about showing Republicans as vaccine hesitant. In our poll, the most vaccine hesitant this time around are Trump supporters, people who voted for Donald Trump. 50% of them are saying they're not getting a vaccine. And I think that's notable as well.
Yeah, and they're encouraging the former president even to take out some kind of statement, because that seems to be the missing group right now in terms of putting the puzzles together to get everybody vaccinated, or enough people to get the herd immunity going. And that sort of did it for that segment. But before we go, it's time to return to the Roper Archives.
Yeah, Lee, you're back. And now we can actually call this Lee's Fun Fact again. So take it away.
Well, this is an interesting one. I assume you noticed that the sun has been out periodically. It's been getting a little warmer. And we took a look at a poll conducted by Audit and Surveys from April of 1983, which asked, do you tend to get spring fever? That is, feel somewhat different when the first warm days of spring arrive? And 69% said yes, they do. 28% said no, they don't. Spring fever is definitely something for most Americans coming out of the winter months, the doldrums of winter, to then sort of say, all right, not bad, not bad. I see it as baseball season, so that's why.
Lee, I'm not sure that's a really well-written question from a methodological standpoint, because do you feel different? Well, yeah, you maybe have hay fever along with your spring fever, so you feel different. There's all kinds of ways you could feel different with spring fever. It may not just be happy, good feelings. It could be other things.
Well, Jay, I could say I definitely feel happier once the warmer weather comes around. It's a time for me to be outside in the sunshine. And after this dreary, dark winter and being in the house so much, I honestly can't wait to get out there and act on that spring fever.
I don't disagree. I'm just saying, the question, has some ambiguity to it, right, Lee?
I think coming up next week, though, the fun fact may be an entirely different variety if I can anticipate what's coming up next
Oh, I
week.
see where we're going with this.
Oh, God.
Yeah, I'll be blowing out a ton of candles between now and then.
Hint, hint, hint.
Well, if that isn't a tease, I don't know what is.
That's a wrap on this week's edition of Poll Hub. Poll Hub is a production of the Marist Poll at Marist College in Poughkeepsie, New York. I'm Mary Griffith and Poll Hub's executive producer. Rounding out our team behind the scenes, Casey Schaff, our production supervisor, Amelia Morell, our production assistant, and Marcello Bettman, our trusted editor. Of course, many thanks to the Roper Center Archive at Cornell University. They provide us with the ability to look back at survey questions and results over the decades. And if you have questions or comments, hit us up on social media. We're at Marist Poll on Twitter and Marist Poll on Facebook and Instagram. Check out our online learning academy. The Marist Poll Academy can be found at maristpoll.com. That's where we give you the 101 on polls, methodology, and so much more. Oh, yeah, and it's free. Finally, if you like what you hear on Poll Hub, please consider leaving a review on your podcasting app of choice. Positive reviews help others find us, and while you're at it, go ahead and subscribe. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll see you next week.